my first job was teaching 7th grade social studies. And if I remember, yes, someone, thank you. If I remember how these worked, one of two things happened to me. Either I felt resentful that I was losing a day off. I was one of those evil teachers. That's why I went on to teach college. It's where evil teachers go to die. My mom once said to me, those who can't do anything teach. I think that's false. But those who can't teach at a university. And those who don't teach well at a university end up teaching Socratically, because it's our way of bluffing through our inability to actually say anything interesting. But if I remember in service correctly, as an evil teacher, one of the major things, I either felt super guilty at the end of it, because speakers came from outside and reminded me that I should grade papers much more quickly than I did. I was one of those people that was always carrying home grocery bags full of papers because I put it off. Yes, don't do that. That's wrong. You'll end up teaching at a university if you keep that up. I either fell into that trap of feeling guilty because whatever I heard just pointed to my own inadequacy, or the danger I'll run into today, the person said things so abstract that they actually didn't help me in my daily work. I wondered, what in the world? This is a vacation day, and I lost it to hear something that's so abstract it doesn't help me. So the problem with inviting a philosopher of education and now a provost, a chief academic officer at a university, is I'm more likely to commit the second error than the first. But hopefully we'll have time for questions, and particularly if you want to know how to apply this sort of thing to 7th grade social studies. I'd really welcome that kind of question, because I'll probably have some thoughts, and hopefully they'll be useful thoughts and not guilt-inducing thoughts, because we're on the same team. I look at the history of the United States roughly this way. In the 17th century, the United States got started. But in many ways, by the 18th century, Philadelphia served as the paradigmatic American city. Which is why if you still want to look at roots of American culture, you visit Philadelphia. The United States, from the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, to a first capital, was born in Philadelphia, sort of the intellectual center for Enlightenment America. And then, it's not hard to see that in the 19th century, Chicago became the paradigmatic American city. It's no accident that the greatest president of the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln, came from Illinois, an area deeply influenced by Chicago, that Chicago became the site of the great exhibition, that the Chicago fire was the great disaster of the era. The D.L. Moody campaign, centered in Chicago, became paradigmatic for the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, I really think Los Angeles, the area where all of us live and have spent our time, became the city of the 20th century, whether it was kind of the Beach Boys sound or California dreaming or the most influential president, whatever your politics of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan, at least the end of the 20th century, came from California. I think that's no accident, because by the middle of the 20th century, Los Angeles, California, if it happened first in California, you expected it to happen all over the United States. Steve Jobs, Walt Disney. The list is sort of endless. Now, I'd like to argue that in the 21st century, the city that will be paradigmatic is Houston. That's self-serving because I happen to live in Houston at HBU. But as energy and medical science and the experiment in whether a super diverse city can exist in a red state, in a state with no income tax, and survive, I think that the eyes of the United States are much more on Texas right now. think it's no accident that if the Republican Party nominates a person, they're very likely to come from Texas, whether it's the Bush dynasty or not. That has become, in some ways, the paradigmatic, at least red state, American experience. Now, why do I go through all of that? It's not a commercial for Houston or HBU. I don't represent the Chamber of Commerce, and I still own a house in California. In fact, probably always own a house in California for reasons that I'd rather not describe, and raised all my kids here. It's because it puts us on the same team. I know of 3 high schools in the United States I can recommend, one of them in Chicago. One of them, I just did a graduation for them in Houston. And then this school here in Los Angeles. And I think it's no accident that what I view as the pivotal leadership training programs would be found in those 3 places. Because Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and yes, even Philadelphia, still deeply matter to the American psyche. There is a vision of America that y'all are uniquely capable of representing. Yeah, it's funny, I am wearing boots, and I do say y'all, and now it's because I moved to Texas, but I'm really from West Virginia, so if you go and replay the tapes, I always did all those things, but now I get blamed for them, for moving. But here's the point. If you don't succeed in your task, then I think the experience of this republic may fail. In other words, you're located in one of those locations, geographically, culturally, that matter. And your students will have disproportionate influence. We could have also talked about Washington in terms of government and New York City. But I'd like to suggest that if we added those 2 cities to the list, we would have nearly exhausted those regions that lead the country. What happens here in the greater Los Angeles area will affect Texas more than what happens in the state capital, Austin. What happens here in Los Angeles will surely affect West Virginia more than the people of West Virginia, how they vote, what they wish would happen. You don't have to be a sort of remarkable genius to know that the influence of a TV show like Parks and Recreation, in terms of its morality, was more influential in the state of Indiana, where its fictional setting is, than the actual Parks and Recreation places in the state of Indiana, doing all the actual work. And Los Angeles continues to lead in that way as a legacy of its dominant position from the 20th century, just as Philadelphia continues to draw people every year, millions of them, to the cradle at Independence Hall of our American Republican experience. What you do matters. You could be 3 times larger in my home state of West Virginia, 3 times wealthier, faster, smarter, everything. And the influence of your graduates and your intellectual influence would matter less. If sometimes you feel pressure on yourself, I'd like to suggest it's because you are at the edge of a time of great cultural change. And so I'll try to tell you what is coming, not as a prophet, I don't play one on television even, but as a cultural commentator. We've talked in the past together, but let me not assume that you've pored over videotape from previous conversations, about the 75-year rule in cultural changes. Now, you don't have to be very smart to figure out why there's a 75-year rule, why cities keep their dominance for that period of time, or revolutions carry on for about that period of time, because it's about the length of time that a leadership class can exist while still governing. Recently in Texas, in the primaries, it was a little sad. The last serving World War II veteran in Congress, who was in his 90s, was primaried out. He lost a primary to a man in his 40s. What this means is that as of January, the last veteran of the Second World War to be at the federal level of government as a leader, as a voting leader, will be gone. Now, here's a suggestion. The American experience began around 1789. And about the time that the revolutionary generation, the generation of Philadelphia, passed from the scene, the original sin of that generation, the problem they kicked down the street, race-based slavery, came to haunt their grandchildren. When the generation that created the horrible compromises that allowed slavery to continue no longer could keep the compromise sewed together, and then we faced the crisis of 1861 to 1865. Now, this isn't, again, prophecy. Things don't occur exactly 70 years, but it's shocking how close such calculations come. By 1876, Reconstruction ended. People forget that the American Civil War did not end in 1865. The South was properly occupied by Union armies who allowed the newly freed slaves to participate in government until 1876, when the equivalent of hanging chads, yes, in the state of Florida, produced an election so close that Florida presented disputed electoral votes between the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrat candidate, Samuel Tilden. Shades of Bush-Gore, yes? And the Civil War came to an end as part of the compromise that made Rutherford B. Hayes a one-term president. Well, 70 years after the Civil War finally came to an end, we get the great crisis of the American experience, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, where the Civil War generation was still honored. Go look at YouTube video of Franklin Roosevelt standing in front of aging Civil War veterans at Gettysburg. Still enough of them to reenact plausibly Pickett's charge on the field of Gettysburg. But these old men, these old veterans of our great crisis, were no longer capable of running the nation. So that even though great men like Theodore Roosevelt had existed in the time between the Civil War and this great reboot of the Depression and World War II, they could only make marginal change within the great compromise of 1876. My suggestion to you, as those who live in one of the great American cities, and in fact who bear the heritage of the 20th century more than any other place, is that the crisis of our time is likely upon us. That when I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, I essentially lived in a world that the World War II generation created. And by the normal that they made, where California, Disneyland on Sunday night when I didn't go to church. My dad was a pastor and was so irritated with the fact that they programmed the best family programming on Sunday night that he finally gave up one night and told us after much whining that we could stay home and watch The Wizard of Oz, another great product of California. I turned on the television in an act of young teenage rebellion, and it blew up. Like smoke proceeded from the back. Now, we were so poor that meant no TV for maybe a year. I learned an important lesson there. I don't know what it is. It's a kind of problem of evil problem. Why God doesn't always punish me so directly and immediately, I don't know, but there you have it. So those of you who sit in the place where the great triumphs of the 20th century occurred, where the Okies came to California and created what one writer called white trash paradise, where immigration produced the most successful melting pot in the world, or mosaic, or salad bowl, whatever your preferred analogy is, where experiments in government, from Pat Brown's more activist government to Ronald Reagan's conservative government, swept the nation in their turn. We, in California, planted the seeds for good and for evil of the 21st century. But the World War II generation that came out of the war determined to remake the world. And after all, does anyone believe that the same nation that went into the war was the nation that came out of it? For good and for bad, no. Following the 70-year rule and seeing what just happened last week in Texas, we know this: the World War II generation cannot save us again. That whatever good they did will die with them if we don't renew it. And whatever evil they left undone, and every generation leaves an evil undone, unfinished, is going to come to fruition now. If the war ended functionally in the late 40s, as the troops demobbed and came home, how many is 45 plus 70? Any math geniuses here? How many? Yes. We would expect a great American crisis to occur somewhere in the late 2015 to 2020s. This isn't prophecy, and it doesn't mean things will get bad. I would argue that the country that came out of the Second World War was in almost every way improved from the country that went into the Second World War. Things like the Japanese internment camps that passed with very little opposition during the Second World War would have been impossible by the 1950s. Because our experience of the race-based evil of Nazi Germany made the racism of the United States less easy to defend. It didn't make the civil rights movement inevitable that it would go as well as it did. It still required the massive intellectual and spiritual leadership of men and women like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks. Yet, it meant that the Anglo community of the South, which had been so dominant, having seen the horrors of Nazi Germany, were unlikely to unleash the force of the establishment on peaceful protesters. They weren't going to pull a Putin or a Stalin. The lynch mobs could no longer be effective because young Southern boys that had been to Dachau and Auschwitz were changed by the experience. Now I simplify, but I simplify to make this point. Much of what we think of as normal, including your job right now, are artifacts of the World War II compromise. They didn't have to exist the way they are now. And my suggestion is, in the great crisis that's coming, much of what you accept in this school will pass away as normal. And something new will replace it. Let me give you one example, and then I'll pause and take some questions, because I don't want to just talk at you. And though I'm familiar with this, maybe this will take some of you by surprise. So I will pause and take some questions in a second. But let me prove that your very project is a kind of Californian mid-20th century project. For 400 years, from about the 1620s forward, the Reynolds family lived in the United States. We came to the Jamestown region. One Reynolds family decided to buy slaves, plant tobacco, and become fabulously wealthy, forming the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Another group of Reynoldses decided slavery was wicked, kept moving further and further west, making ever keener and keener real estate decisions, like buying the entire Charleston, West Virginia river valley and trading it away for a gun to shoot a bear, being left with neither the river valley, nor the gun, nor the bear, several hundred years later. I'll let you guess which Reynolds family I'm from. As my grandfather put it to me, when Virginia seceded from the Union, the Reynolds family in Western Virginia seceded from Virginia to fight for Mr. Lincoln and liberty. My great-great-grandfather leaving a horse in the middle of the field to go get captured almost immediately and serve most of the war in a Confederate prison camp. We're just so good at everything in my family. No, the point of that story is this. In 400 years of living as fairly successful lower middle class to middle class people, not one Reynolds until my grandfather's generation went past the 6th grade. Like Lincoln himself, who calculated that he had about 1 year of formal education, schooling. That's depressing. Just let that sink in. And then go read the second inaugural. Like Mr. Lincoln himself, Reynoldses may have had to serve as postmasters, blacksmiths, mechanical engineers, as little as a year of formal education. The GI Bill, following the Second World War, changed everything. My grandfather had been so brilliant that they allowed him to get more education than any Reynolds had ever had. He was allowed to go to the 8th grade and then repeat the 8th grade, not because he failed, but because he was a gifted student, and gifted students were allowed to go to the 8th grade again. He could have, in fact, taught school with that credential. The GI Bill was to a great extent created because prior to the war, in places like West Virginia, a third to a half of the population had been unemployed. And until the war, men in my family had not drawn a regular paycheck for years. And the fear was, also the opportunity, that when millions of men were demobilized at the end of the war, that massive unemployment would reoccur, only this time amongst men who had been trained to kill people. And we forget that the seeds of revolution, which had swept Tsarist Russia after the First World War, were rightly feared in the democracies after the Second World War. Now, fortunately for the United States, though unfortunately for the rest of the world, we found ourselves the only untouched industrial power. And with people like my grandfather with large amounts of money that they had not been able to spend on anything. So that we went through a manufacturing boom the like of which the United States will never experience again. So that it turned out the fears were fairly unwarranted. But government money, through the GI Bill and poured into high schools and universities, we sometimes forget that the centralization of high schools was created in great measure by the federal government and by state governments worried about the future as a kind of child care provision. The elongation of childhood was created after the Second World War so that my daddy was the first Reynolds to go to high school and then went to college and then went to grad school, leaving me nothing to do. But it's not surprising, many established families for whom high school had been the greatest aspiration suddenly found themselves sending their kids to college. And my grandfather never got over that. When I went to college, he spoke of high school and college in reverential terms. The idea that you would celebrate a high school graduation with big celebrations is, if you think about it, irrational. A child goes to school, K through 12 nowadays. That's normal. If they don't do that, that's abnormal. And yet we celebrate it as if they've accomplished something remarkable. Because in the 1940s, they had. Prom was a rite of passage where you got married. And now it continues in secular culture as hopefully the time you've waited till that long where you might lose your virginity. In an entirely different cultural milieu. The world has changed. Now I want to pause and say, the Reynolds family outside of John Mark did not get any new jobs after we went to high school and college. They gave us exactly the same jobs that we received with 6th grade educations after we got college educations. The apprenticeship on the job still continued through human resources, so that it's not clear that for most Americans who didn't, after all, become scientists and engineers, they mostly became life insurance salespeople, service-oriented people. I mean, why, after all, did we add nursing to college instead of just making it something hospitals trained women, in particular, to do? Why aren't doctors trained through apprenticeship? Because the federal government chose not to make it so. Why does this school rightly pride itself upon its accreditation? Where did the notion of schools being accredited come from? So that schools like HBU or Biola spend large amounts of their time currying favor with WASC here in California or SACS in the southern regions of the United States. It was, to a great extent, to control the allocation of federal money through the GI Bill, so that even the system of education by grades, hoops to jump through, as we know it, are the product of a massive influx of people into a system that the system was not designed to take in an era before computers, where standardization of curriculum had to exist in order to guarantee that a certain level of quality would exist, where large classrooms, large relative to the one-room schoolhouse of yore, and efficiencies and centralization had to occur because the technology of the 1940s, typewriters and filing cabinets, would not allow for anything else. And it wasn't just technology. You can't create a college professor ex nihilo. So that people like my mentor, Sheldon Van Auken, could get out post-war as a veteran of the Second World War with his Oxford BA, which turned into an MA automatically, and teach as a historian at Lynchburg College for his entire career. Because colleges were desperate for anyone with a graduate degree who could teach. And we began to churn out huge numbers of PhDs who in the 50s and 60s could expect to find university teaching. That process, by the way, continues in fields like English, where now you're as likely, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much, to play in the NBA as you are to get a full-time job, tenure track in English with a PhD. I have looked up these numbers. Send your student out to work in music. And my alma mater, the Eastman School of Music, claims to be one of the best music programs in the United States, with Juilliard in Indiana. But I know the numbers for Juilliard. What percentage of Juilliard graduates end up being employed in music? Does anyone want to guess? It's pretty high, actually. Give me a guess. Juilliard. Your graduate here gets out of Juilliard, big win, probably goes on to the cover of the high school magazine, website. What percent end up with jobs in music? Lower. Lower. Higher. It's 16%. The last time I checked, and this was a little while ago, the average wage for someone full-time in music was $16,000 a year. Now, we continue to produce graduates in music. I'm not even attacking majoring in music. I majored in philosophy after all. But what I'm saying is, notice that we haven't stopped producing PhDs or degrees in fields as if it's still 1948 and a BA in art history will be respected in the workplace. A crisis is coming in education. I used to say this and expect some contradiction. In fact, one time I was written up for apocalyptic thinking by a supervisor. Now the things I said 10 years ago about this are in the Chronicle of Higher Education every week, as schools like HBU are closing or firing all their humanities professors in an endeavor not to close all over the United States. A crisis is upon us, and notice you work in an institution that exists to great measure because of the great compromises of the late 40s. Right? You serve a constituency that assumes their kids should go to high school. They don't even pray about it. And you serve a constituency that doesn't begin to pray about whether their kids should go to, and they don't even consider, in most cases, whether they should go to grad school, the new college. Now pause and ask yourself, how often is that actually necessary to the life your students will lead? Are there alternative means of delivery that could be chosen? Now let me pause and take questions, and we'll talk about more hopeful things. But what I want you to see is that this school cannot run like any other school, business as usual, because the world is about to change. Wonderful changes occurred in the 20th century, the World War II generation. My favorite example of this is a picture of my mother, who is sitting on a park bench at 16. And I look at that picture and I think, she is so innocent. I mean, seriously, if you grew up in a world where nobody you know has seen the picture of a naked person, like a lewd thing, they might have seen some art, that they found titillating because they'd never seen a nude thing other than in art. There's a look, a sort of innocence that I thought, wow, my kids, who are good kids, don't have that look. They can't. But then I looked up in the picture, and she was sitting in a picnic pavilion that said, whites only. Have things gotten better, or have they gotten worse? Yes. I am not suggesting apocalypse now. What I'm suggesting is this. Y'all here at Trinity, or we at HBU, could go 100 years growing and doing our best. And just given financing, we'd never catch up with the establishment in our lifetimes. But in a reboot generation, if we're nimble and we think, we can prepare our students to recreate the world. Things can get better. They don't have to get worse. And I think that of all the high schools I speak at, and that's a lot, or am invited to speak at in the United States, you're one of 3 that I know of positioned to win. But we have to think together about how to prepare for the change that's coming. Yes, sir. I know you.
With changes coming to higher education, where do you see most students ending up? Like, are they still, because they're probably not going to go to college in the same way, at least, if colleges are hiring humanities professors, right?
Right.
So are students going to stop going to college, or are they going to go to a different university?
Yeah, now here's what's key to this, and this is where I'm going to get vague, and where if I get really specific, you should want to walk out. It is relatively easy to anticipate change. I would argue that you're a fool if you believe anybody who can predict what the change will look like. In other words, the GI Bill that really, and the centralization of high schools that occurred at a state level, occurred for lots of good reasons, but think of the huge numbers of unintended consequences that produced. The rise of the NFL, forget like meta ones, and sort of college football factory system as we've known it, is an artifact of this process. Many unintended consequences that if I could predict them, I'd tell you what stocks to buy or who to invest in, and we'd all get rich and famous. But I know this. Here's one thing you can do. Ask yourself, what was valuable before the Great Change in the 40s? And bet that it will be valuable after the Great Change. Look around your high school and say, how much of what we do is a product of 1945 technology? That will go. Now, the other mistake to make, other than trying to predict the future, is I think to fall into one of 2 errors. One is the Louis XV error. Louis XV, after me, the deluge. So I'm 50 years old. I can probably squeeze out the rest of my career under the old system. And say what? Well, pretty clearly the French monarchy is on its last legs. Change that could still be made would be painful and uncomfortable and might even cost me my job. And it will last my time. Now, there are several ways to be blind this way. One is to pretend that change isn't coming, but I'm guessing that it's now so obvious. 10 years ago when I talked about this, I'd get a lot of that. I get very little of it now. Educators know, look at the decision about tenure that just came out of the courts in the most liberal region in the United States. If you're at a university with tenure, change is coming. It's one reason I went to a university without tenure. Tenure is an artifact of the 40s. It no longer serves the function it was designed to serve. It will go, whether I like it or not. The second problem, other than this reactionary, it'll last my time, so let's just hang in there, is revolutionary. It would be for Trinity, which is doing great good and is awesome. Remember, I think you're one of the best 3 schools I know of in the U.S. To rip everything up and try to anticipate the changes, and so do more harm than good. My favorite example of this are homeschoolers of my generation who looked at the dating process, the courtship processes that occurred after 1945. And we rightly saw in them much to criticize. But at least a segment of the homeschooling community of which I was a part, though they voted red state, lived in the most revolutionary manners possible. They saw the problems in education. What did they do? Tear up the whole thing and try to start anew. They saw the problems in courtship. What did they try to do? Tear up the whole thing and start anew. What always occurs with revolutionary change occurred quite sensibly. Go read my Facebook page on a daily basis as the wreckage of those movements respond to their pain. What occurs when you try to make revolutionary change is the very people you're trying to help get hurt by your attempt to recreate culture out of your own self. An advantage of a big culture is that you can tweak it for its problems and get its benefits because many heads and much experience has gone into creating it. The problem with your little community, if you became revolutionary at Trinity, would be that you would be more likely to destroy good things than you would be to create a better thing. That's why I'm a conservative. In other words, while we have time, how should we change at a place like Trinity? Deliberately, and with what will feel like speed, to the hidebound, the reactionary. But you're already doing this. Your embrace of classical education is, in a sense, an anticipation of the change that's coming. But notice you didn't create a system that made it impossible for your graduates to participate in the UC system as we've known it. Your founders were brilliantly cautious revolutionaries, like the founding fathers in the United States. They changed as little as possible. Now, the bad news is, what will you have to keep doing? Changing. Well, we're revolutionary, but we succeeded. It looks like we can see the future straight ahead of us. We're going to make it. That's the problem with organizations like Trinity. You get to the point where this is going to work. We're going to have a football team. It's all going to come together. We're going to win. We're going to survive. We're finally finding some stability. And then somebody says, oh, bad news. We're a revolutionary organization in this founding fathers sense. We've got to keep growing and changing. And what do people begin to say? We once were young. Now we're kind of tired. And I bet it'll last my time. So any other questions as we've come to the end of my prelude? Everything else I'm going to try to say to you will depend on your accepting the fact that the big picture matters to you. You've got to know it, and y'all have to think about how to incubate appropriate nimbleness, not so you can survive. Forget survival, though in fact it will guarantee your survival. What will happen if you do this? They'll kill you or they'll convert. My general rule of thumb is that this kind of change in the United States comes through muddling through. That we're unlikely to reach a golden age or apocalypse. That it'll be like the World War II compromise, a mixed bag. But the opportunity is that Trinity can become Harvard. You can become the leaders in the new era, not followers. Questions, comments, thoughts? I've tried to persuade you in several different ways that revolutionary change is coming, whether we like it or not. That it probably won't last my time, actually. It might. Remember, you can't predict this sort of thing. By the way, on this rule of thumb, should you invest in China? Seriously, should you invest in China? I might as well say something where you can hold me accountable if I'm wrong. The answer is no, you should not. Because the government that knew Mao, you would expect to pass from the scene somewhere around 2020. And because the Chinese oligarchy is a particularly dysfunctional group of tyrants, you would expect the change to be awful, not muddleish. Though the large Christian population that's grown up in China gives me some degree of hope that they'll muddle through in a non-revolutionary way. That the changes that will have to occur will be incremental. By the way, you would expect India to face a similar crisis. In fact, I think they're undergoing it. Why? When did independence occur? From Britain. Late 40s, early 50s. That transition. Pakistan didn't even exist. So the generation that knew Gandhi is passing from the scene. What do we see? The once dominant political parties in India, the family parties of the independence generation, are being replaced because India is a functional democracy. This may occur peacefully. But the world that knew Indira Gandhi no longer exists in India. Right? So you don't have to be a sort of brain surgeon to get this sort of transition. And we're going to go through it too. Unfortunately, most of the world is going to reboot at almost the same time. That's nearly unprecedented. Why? Because World War II was a what kind of war? World war. And in most of the world, not so much South America, it was the big moment in history. It ended colonialism in sub-Saharan Africa, though in most places more like the 60s. One or two more questions, if there are any. I'm just trying to persuade you that unless you're in your 80s, you're going to have to change. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hold on. Thank you.
Oh, man, I always feel like you should sing Strangers in the Night or something when you have a microphone like that. Welcome to our...
I'd be happy to.
Welcome to our in-service. Go ahead. I'll hum along with you.
Yeah, no, you don't know what you're asking. As Christians,
Yes.
and educators, I'm hearing, paralleling with what you're saying, the term that's been around for some time now, which is post-Christian.
Yeah.
We're raising the first truly post-Christian generation. Ours was the pre-post, right? But now the truly post-Christian generation is being raised, and And we should be constantly reminded, as you did so well with the illustration of your 16-year-old mother, we should be constantly reminded of the imagery and metaphor that these kids are being raised with and without.
Would you like me to cheer you up?
Yes.
Just like I don't think postmodernism is a problem, like I'm a weirdest Christian apologist ever.
Yeah.
I've never met a person I believe to be postmodern outside of a university with a job. Ever.
Yes.
Okay, so let me say, I don't think we're post-Christian. Liking the Queen of England in Britain, belief in God is absolutely stable.
Yes.
Why do you keep reading news headlines about the growth in atheism and other things? Let's pause and tell the truth. Peter Beagle writes in the foreword to, and I'll let you ask your question in a minute. I won't forget, I promise. You have a microphone. I never fight with a guy with a
I'll
microphone.
start singing Strangers in the Night.
We can exchange glances. Peter Beagle writes in the foreword to Lord of the Rings in one American edition, the great science fiction fantasy writer. The 60s were no fouler than the 50s, but they reaped the 50s' foul harvest. In the 1950s, the American establishment was functionally secular. People like Dwight Eisenhower, whom I think, by the way, had a real experience with God while he was in the White House. He was actually not baptized before he became president and was baptized while in the White House, was famous for making statements like this. I paraphrase. Everyone should pray, whatever God you pray to. In other words, American civil religion, from the establishment's point of view, was a kind of, we all go to the local Episcopal or Presbyterian church. Remember, the Episcopal church was called the Republican Party at Prayer in the 1950s. You were the old establishment, and you didn't take religion that seriously. The joke in West Virginia was you got saved as a Baptist, you got wealthy and became a Methodist, and then when you got cold-hearted, you became a Presbyterian or an Episcopalian and ran the country. And the joke existed because in the 50s and 60s, the sort of compromise was, yeah, we at Harvard don't believe in God, but we're Christian. So that William F. Buckley in the 50s could write his famous kind of coming out party book, God and Man at Yale. And what did he claim? Yale was hostile to Christian values. But this so outed the establishment that they furiously responded in things like the New York Times, the president of Yale. Yale is too a Christian university. Buckley is just not very American. Why isn't he very American? What church did he belong to? He's Roman Catholic. And he takes the ooky, spooky parts of religion seriously. Unlike the WASP establishment. White, Anglo-Saxon, but not real religious. Now, what happened over the last 2 decades? People like my uncles, who would have nominally believed in God and gone to church Christmas and Easter and a little more often than that, baptized their kids, have stopped. If you were a nominal mainliner, you're now a nun, N-O-N-E. But you might believe in God. And certainly to the extent that you're religious, most of your religious language comes from where? Memories of Christianity. If you think we're not awash in Christianity in the United States, try being a Hindu. Seriously, go read Hindu blogs. And you'll see that even our atheists pretend Christianity is the dominant way of thinking. Has atheism particularly grown? No, more atheists have come out of the closet. It's like, are there more gay people? Maybe not. We just get better reporting. So why do I say all of that? Because I think an important thing in the middle of our discouragement with the way things are going, and you should be discouraged, some things are bad, they may even lead to persecution, is to underestimate the chips we begin with. The most discouraging thing maybe for a school that's traditionally Christian might be your own children's views on gay marriage. But let's remind ourselves that the worst polling on this issue I've seen is that 1 in 4 millennials agree with the traditional view of marriage. It's 1 in 4 in a poll where the pollster's almost surely a young adult calling you on the phone, where second, see Parks and Recreation, there's a politically correct answer, and millennials believe they're the only ones, if they support traditional marriage, they're the only one of their kind. 1 in 4 up to 1 in 3 millennials will still argue for traditional marriage. Here's the good news. Most of the bigots, people who just didn't like gay people, are gone. If you still support traditional marriage, you don't even like it that you support it, but you're principled. It's about where we were with abortion in the early 70s. Now, there's some differences, and we could talk about those, but don't underestimate the assets we start with. What we saw in the pro-life cause was what? A fundamentally Christian nation has never become comfortable with the idea of abortion on demand, ever. Here's my argument. A fundamentally Christian nation still is of two minds about the sexual revolution. Don't believe me? Sure, you're allowed to have sex before marriage. 60-some% of Americans now think that's moral. But what does that mean about a plurality of Americans? They think it's immoral. Maybe a third. And what's the opinion of adultery? 9%, the last poll I saw, think adultery is moral. We're of two minds with the sexual revolution. Europeans would point that out to us quickly. How do we feel? Okay, we're awash in porno. How do we feel about pornography? We don't like it. Don't believe me? Go to a secular place and announce at the lunch table loudly that you sat and watched pornos all night. And see what the reaction is. Totally secular place. Become the porno guy. Go make porno and tell people. Become an abortionist. Your mama won't be so proud. They're having trouble getting abortionists. So I'm not just trying to cheer you up, right? We got problems, but we've always had problems, and don't overlook the assets. Now we'll get to your question.
Well, I think you may have answered it, because I was going to say I don't really like that term, post-Christian, and what has really happened in the last 25 years. And I think you answered it. You said last 20, but
yeah,
I kind of see it starting in 1992. So
yeah,
I think you answered it. You did.
Yeah, I think
what has really happened.
I think that college has a secularizing impact on people, but if you came from a strongly evangelical place or a place like Trinity, research now shows, this is the good news, your kids are likely to go back to church. No, they really are. We have some problems with some moral issues, but the truth is the great attrition amongst young adults has not occurred amongst evangelicals. That's an urban legend. If you raise your kids to be Christian, now this doesn't help me. I have a kid that's wandering away from faith. So the fact that 3 out of 4 of my kids are doing well is a great statistic, but really sad if you're a parent. But after all, as a school, that's about what you're going to run. 3 and 4 is really good. If they hadn't come here, you could have inverted the statistics. Probably. But you have to accept what's possible, not what's not possible. All our kids will grow up to be Christians. You'd be a horrible school if you made it that way. You would have destroyed them and their ability to choose. So I hope I've given you some hope. One more question, and then we'll move on to the more hopeful parts of this. I'm still in Houston time. What time is it?
9:40.
Excellent. We're almost done. You have run well. One more question. I feel it out there looming. It's bothering my brain. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering,
If you don't wait till he brings the microphone, Chris will feel like he has no function.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure you're probably familiar with George Friedman, The Next 100
Sure,
Years.
sure.
Those kind of geopolitical forecasts.
Sure.
Which is interesting. I think it would in some ways agree with what you're saying.
Yeah,
although
I tend to think about the world culturally and philosophically, so nothing I've said basically applies to economics, because I don't think about economics. I'm talking about underlying culture. I'm sure it has economic implications, but I do have to say that because sometimes people think they can pick the stock market based on what I've just said. No, you can't at all.
Right.
Go
and
ahead.
Yeah, and like I said, though, I think that he has the same take where it's easy to forecast change. It's hard to get specific, and it's foolish to get specific.
Right.
Do you think, but given some factors, like I found it very interesting that you said Houston is going to be the next kind of the 21st century.
I have to say, World Magazine just ran a cover story saying that, and so has The Economist and several other places. It used to be really clever when I said that, and now it just sounds like I'm repeating conventional wisdom. There's so much money, new money in Houston, that the number of evangelical multimillionaires is unprecedented. It's like the Bible Belt with money. So, it's really a bizarre place. There's no zoning in Houston. So whole new cities are being built because totally flat, surrounded by limitless flat land, Houston. So what happens to housing? I live in a 4,000 square foot house that could be purchased for $350,000. Because if it gets much more expensive, and that's viewed as a costly house in Houston, the house I lived in Southern California across from the university would sell for $80,000 in the same neighborhood. What happens? They'll go 10 minutes down 59 and build a whole new development. There are no mountains enclosing us. Now, eventually, you get 2 hours out, people aren't going to want to do the commute. But 20 minutes from downtown, can drive 2 minutes to Cowles. So Houston is a long way from being full. A long way. My friends call it house porn. When you start looking at house prices in Houston, and Houstonians are complaining about the cost of housing. Yes, sir. Keep going.
Well, it's just, I guess I was kind of going to ask you to extrapolate on that. Part of it, I think, like, for example, the Keystone Pipeline, which maybe it's inevitable, and if that happens, then all of a sudden we're like competing with Saudi
It is
Arabia.
inevitable, like fracking has, in the end, fracking, like widening the Panama Canal. Los Angeles' wealth is to some extent built on the port of Los Angeles, and I've never met a Los Angelino who understands that. Stuff comes from China, gets dumped here, then is trucked across the United States. Where does most of the population of the United States live? East of the Mississippi. When the Panama Canal is widened, they're going to dump stuff in the port of Houston, folks, not in the port of Los Angeles, because we're in the middle of the country in Houston. So it sounds like boosterism. It's one reason I went there. But here's the good news if you're a Los Angelino. Chicago didn't disappear. Does everyone get that? New York City didn't disappear. What you build during your moment in the sun, like Wall Street, unless you're really stupid, you maintain. This will always be the dream city. It means you'll matter. Look at cities in Virginia that were very important that can't even support an NFL franchise. That's my pick for an important city. Oh, wait. Texas is unavoidable. Not even a Texan, as they would point out if I were there. Philadelphia still matters more than it should, given its geography, weather, and actual influence. Because it's an American city and always will be. What is happening to Buffalo will not happen to Philadelphia to the same extent. Buffalo could disappear like Detroit. Philadelphia will always matter. Los Angeles will always matter, and matter disproportionately because, of course, you're just leaving your epic moment. It could always be renewed as well. Okay, any other thoughts? Let's look at hope. What is hope? Hope is what I think you should be teaching fundamentally. Begin to redesign your curriculum around the virtue of hope. What are the three great Christian virtues? There are three. Yeah, faith, hope, and love, which I'll call charity, just so we don't confuse it with icky ideas of love. I'm going to suggest today that hope is the Christian virtue for the age we're entering into. I'm going to make a prediction. Now, that's an odd thing to say, because what is the greatest Christian virtue? Love. And the Bible itself says so. In fact, all the other two virtues, faith and hope, can be subsumed in love. In one way, I could have said, design your school around love, and you'll continue. But that's vacuous enough in the world we live in that I'm going to break it down at least this much, the big idea of love. There's charity, and you'll notice that in our culture, that's not controversial. If you guys became the school that loves, how much flack would you get? Not a lot. People might argue with your interpretation. But every once in a while, I actually have to write what I call a Jesus is Lord blog post. Because for the most part, as someone who tends to focus on love in my writing, I don't offend that many people. Despite the fact that I'm an old dude, white conservative Republican, since I don't write a lot about politics, I actually have a fair number of non-Christian or left-of-center readers who enjoy writing what I write. Because we're so deeply Christian in the United States that even libertines want to appropriate Christian language like marriage. By which I don't just mean the gay rights movement. I mean people who will get married 5 times like Rush Limbaugh. Despite his libertine lifestyle, he still wants to appropriate Christian language and live within a roughly Christian context while getting some treats on the side. Charity is popular. I would argue that in the United States, faith is popular. Nowadays, people don't want to say they're religious or Christian. They say, I'm a person of faith. In fact, some people who don't like Christian apologetics have retreated into just saying, well, this is my faith. This is what I believe about morality based on my faith. Leave me alone. This is the Amish strategy to Christian survival. Now, I'm not even putting it down. The next time you talk to a friend that has no tolerance for a school like Trinity, say this. When we were in power, we allowed a group of pacifists who wouldn't even swear in a court of law. Space to grow and thrive. Notice you can affirm when you raise your hand in court, not swear. Why? Because a tiny minority of religious Americans refused to swear. We allowed Quakers enormous exemptions. And then later, the more extreme group, the Amish, enormous exemptions to the point that the Amish are spreading across the United States. They're multiplying rapidly. You want some good news? We are so right, ethically, that if we simply get an Amish exemption, we'll win. That's why we may not. The Amish are beginning to annoy secular people. Why? They refuse to disappear. And yet they are utterly at war with modernity. True? But we tolerated them and their communities. Tell your secular friends that at the very least you'd like to be treated like the Amish were treated by us. Just view us as quaint. Leave us alone. Why won't they leave us alone? Why would I suggest they won't leave us alone? What is our problem that the Amish, it's a problem the Amish didn't have? We are big, rich, and powerful. There are too many of us. If you ever get discouraged, ask yourself, why aren't we cute like the Amish? No, seriously, I'm a member of an Orthodox church, and amazingly, unlike Roman Catholics in the United States, we escape almost all politically correct criticism. If I wanted to bag out on you guys in the culture wars, I could just say, I'm Greek Orthodox. And everybody thinks my big fat Greek wedding and hugs us. We have beards, and so we're not culturally relevant. There are so few of us that we don't matter. We're cute. Evangelicals, why do I write as an evangelical? First of all, because I am one. Mere Christian, evangelical, then denominational. Because evangelicals are in the crossfire. So if you get discouraged, realize that if you were just cute, no one would criticize you. They might leave you alone. Faith is therefore acceptable. Now, obviously, hope is too. But I'm going to make a strong claim, and that is that if it weren't for Christianity, hope wouldn't be a virtue at all. The Greeks would have accepted the goodness of love. Love is a great God, Plato says in the Symposium, or has one of his characters say in the Symposium. Faith is an epistemological term for believing something for which you don't have certain evidence. All just people live, Plato would say, by faith. It's the only way to live, because you're certain about so little. Does that sound politically correct? Am I certain that God exists? No. So I live by faith. I believe I have evidence God exists, but I'm not certain. I believe I have evidence that my wife loves me, but I'm never certain. I don't take it for granted or I'd be in trouble. I live by faith. And when I've explained that to people, they never doubt that that's a good thing. The fundamental virtue that produces charity and faith is hope. And it is hope that most schools in the United States, it is hope that we're incapable of viewing as a virtue. Because you see, the ancient Greeks, elpida, did not view hope as a virtue in the same way that we will soon not view hope as a virtue, that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not the people who hit you with a ruler. don't view hope as a virtue, but as a vice, as wishful thinking. What is hope? The Christian virtue of our age that is the aspiration of the image of God for something that is better than what is. I recently debated an atheist, Dan Barker. You can go watch it on YouTube. And the main point I kept trying to make to him over and over again is that from is, you can learn nothing about what should be. Is does not imply ought. It is the case that most cultures have practiced slavery. Ought they to have? No. It is the case that misogyny exists and that women are more abused than men. Ought that to be the case? You ought to be able to thunder, no. Ought comes from hope. That things can be different than they are. But the ancient Greeks viewed hope as wishful thinking and a delusion. The story of Pandora's box sums this up best. And when I was a kid, I heard a Christianized version of it. The gods wanted to punish humankind for Prometheus bringing fire. And so they gave to the woman, Pandora, a box. They would have given it to the man, but he would have put it in the garage and lost it. So they gave it to a woman. Now, it's not politically correct, so don't shoot the messenger. Because they believed that if they gave something like a box to a woman and told her not to open it, that she surely would eventually open it. Tell a woman not to go into the West Wing, she will go. This is all, fairy tales just depend on this time and time again. This is a virtue of womankind, traditionally. They can't be stopped from knowing. Pandora opens the box. What comes out of it? All the evils of the world. And the way I was told the story in school, a kind of 1970s elementary school, secular but awash in Christianity, was that the last thing to come out of the box was hope. Because the gods, got a little nice. They got saved right at the end. No! Why did the gods put hope in the box? So that we would stupidly keep going when we ought to recognize how futile, hopeless, and meaningless our life was. But then we wouldn't get enough punishment. I'm pretty happy right now. I love my wife. I love my job. I love my kids. It isn't going to end well. What is the one thing you know all your students will do? Die. How many people win? None. Hope depends on the fact that futile human change can matter. And I would argue it is unsupportable outside of one of the world's great monotheistic faiths. Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. Since I'm talking to Christians, we'll just treat it as a Christian virtue. It is hope that has been most harmed by the revolutions my generation implemented since the Second World War. And we will undercut faith and charity as a result. This must be a school that inculcates an aspiration towards the image of God, that creates rational hope. And it can only do so by constantly inculcating early glimpses of the mysterious other, the world beyond the world we live in, that gives us hope that the changes that take place, the pain and suffering that occur in our life, can have meaning. Virtual reality and a denial of reality can produce meaningful pleasure, but it cannot produce meaningful pain. But all great educational accomplishments come at the end of meaningful pain. But if there is not hope for a better world, then many of your students will begin to ask, am I going to Trinity so I can go to college, so I can get a good job to send my kids to Trinity, so they can go to college in a system that inevitably will not last, that will become dust? Outside of a Christian worldview, can you suffer meaningfully? I have so many friends who would like to be married. And forget gay marriage. Every time I talk about marriage now, that's what people think I'm talking about. I'm not. Most of the people I know that want to get married and cannot are heterosexual Christians who can't find anyone who wants to marry them. And so sometimes I'm told when I talk about gay marriage, you're dooming people to a life of celibacy. Remember Paul saying it's better to be celibate than to be married, but some of you cannot. In our culture, that's to doom you to misery. And there is a kind of suffering in it. Let's not be mistaken. Why should anyone suffer? A Christian has a hopeful answer to that. How can singleness in this life be worthwhile? How can it become fecund in the world to come? If there is no world to come, then it's a hell of a thing. What three things destroy hope? Ugliness at a young age or deep harm. Better to tie a millstone around your neck than to harm a child. Why? Because I believe that if ugliness or deep harm is done to a child, you can destroy their ability to aspire or deeply harm it, to see that things should be one way even when they're not. It's destroyed by gratuitous pain, pain that leads nowhere. And yet, those are not our chief problems, though they're great enough. Here's the risk you run. I believe hope is being destroyed in this generation of students by gratuitous pleasure. Hope depends on the ability to be discontent, to peep through the curtain and see that something better is possible. Young adults, K through 12, K through 16, that receive gratuitous pleasure, who are titillated at every turn, who are never allowed to be bored and work through boredom to joy, have the basis of hope destroyed in their life. They become like the characters in an Oscar Wilde play, burned out, cynical, witty, wags in their day, but unable to have faith and love because unable to have hope. Things have never been other than they should be. Oh, what a beautiful feeling. Oh, what a beautiful day. Why does the song say it's beautiful? Everything that destroys hope. Trinity, if it wants to benefit from the change that's coming, and we'll talk about this in the days to come, needs to be one of the few schools that inculcate intentional meaningful pain and failure in the lives of your students.